Dr. Sherene Razack is a distinguished professor and the Penny Kaner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies at UCLA. Her research and teaching focus on racial violence, and she is also the founder of the virtual research and teaching network Racial Violence Hub, RV Hub for short. Dr. Razack was formerly a distinguished professor of critical race and gender studies in the Department of Social Justice, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto. There she taught courses such as race, space, and citizenship, race and knowledge, production, and racial violence and the law. Her work in Canada influenced many areas of social justice here in the United States and in Canada, including public attention she drew to the violence against Indigenous women in Canada. A feminist critical race scholar, Dr. Razack has published 6 single-authored books and 3 edited and co-edited collections, as well as over 80 journal articles and book chapters. Her publications illustrate the thematic areas of anti-colonial, anti-racist feminist scholarship that she pursues. And one of my personal favorite books by Dr. Razack is Casting Out: The Eviction of Muslims from Western Law and Politics. And so today she's going to give us a sneak preview of her forthcoming book, and I will let her go into the details on that. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Sherene Razack.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you, Sahar, for that generous introduction. I'm really glad to have a chance to test drive my book forthcoming with Minnesota Press called Nothing Has to Make Sense: Anti-Muslim Racism, Law, and Global White Supremacy. So I hope you'll see why the title is appropriate in a second. So before I begin, I would like you to have a quick look. I'll share my screen at these t-shirts. See if that works. Okay, so if you look at these t-shirts, you will see, first of all, this one on the left, Georgia Governor candidate Brian Kemp gives a thumbs up as he takes a selfie with Jim Stachowiak, an anti-Muslim and guns rights activist, advocate. On the right, you'll see a t-shirt sold on Amazon. I'm not anti-Islam, Islam is anti-me. There's one you're probably familiar with that says infidel. It's a military army infidel t-shirt. And the one on the left, you see 2 anti-Muslim protesters at a free speech rally. And really what's blocked out for politeness sake, but it basically, their t-shirt says, "Fuck Islam." So you get the gist of it. Okay, so let me stop sharing and move on. Okay, so today, of course, anti-Muslim t-shirts are in fashion. And I want, before I launch into that, let me give you the quotation I've got at the head of my chapter, which is from Renee Berglund, a terrific book called The National Uncanny. And Berglund says, once they're in our heads, it's difficult to distinguish between ghosts, demons, and dream figures. So remember that. Today's anti-Muslim t-shirts are in fashion. Sold everywhere, they adorn protesters at freedom of speech rallies and are worn by political constituents of both the left and the right, an indication of the political capital to be gained from denigrating Muslims. They range, as you saw, from Allah is not God and Muhammad is not his prophet, to Fuck Islam, to cartoons from the French magazine Charlie Hebdo, depicting Muslim men and boys as rapists, and also to the more restrained, I'm not anti-Islam, Islam is anti-me. The t-shirts are pedagogical sites that provide a window into contemporary attitudes to Islam and to Muslims. And through this window, we see that Muslims remain entrenched in popular culture as a culturally backward, uncivilized people, of a religion that is antithetical to Christian and Western traditions. Muslims are cast as the historical enemies of Europe and imagined as murderous avengers invading and polluting white Christian nations. Over time, the imaginaries shift. The Muslim of the military expeditions and wars of the Middle Ages and the barbarous occupiers of the Holy Land becomes the refugee at the border of Europe, and it ultimately morphs into Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Throughout, Muslims are dream figures of a politics proclaiming the civilizational superiority of Europeans and of white Christendom. A solid geopolitical line connects the wearers of T-shirts bearing anti-Muslim slogans to the cartoonists lampooning Muhammad as a pedophile, to the users of the white supremacist website Gates of Vienna, on which the Ottoman ruler Suleiman the Magnificent is depicted with his armies threatening Europe, or even the video game Crusader Kings, where contemporary gamers indulge their most cherished medieval fantasies of a holy war between Christian Europe and its Islamic enemies. How do Muslims matter to those who imagine themselves in a 21st century holy war and called upon to defend white Christian life? So this book, which I'm calling Nothing Has to Make Sense, considers various constituencies for whom Allah is not God, the people for whom whiteness, Christianity, and the Muslim as archetypical enemy come together to provide a deep sense of purpose, selfhood, and national belonging. The book aims to be particularly attentive to the legal and political projects initiated by white subjects who believe, in Gus and Hage's words, that in acting Islamophobically, they are protecting what makes their lives worth living. If home is a place where Allah is not God, the anti-Muslim subject described in this book is often someone who feels aggrievement and rage that home is being invaded and must be defended. Emotions that circulate around the Muslims, but Muslims are seldom the only target. And T-shirt wearers, such as these, display a range of antipathies that amount to white resentment of racialized and minoritized people. Black people, indigenous people, Jews, and a caste of racialized others, sexual minorities, often join Muslims in a political imaginary that centers whiteness. Importantly, however, as the T-shirts illustrate, white and white aspiring anti-Muslim racists are not all cut from the same cloth. Commitments to white supremacy come in many fabrics, and anti-Muslim racism, like all racisms, is multi-layered and uneven. Whether North American or European, extremist or liberal, religious or secular, anti-Muslim actors insist on the idea of a threatening Islamic other and on the inextricable link between whiteness and Christianity, even when that connection is expressed in the language of secularism and sometimes in the language of Zionism. In each context, white supremacy is upheld by a racial animus directed at Muslims, emotions that drive an anti-Muslim politics. If anti-Muslim T-shirts create a powerful anti-Muslim affect with the protection of whiteness at its core, they do so in different registers. The T-shirt Allah is not God arranges the world in a hierarchy of two kinds of people, believers of a Christian God and those who serve Allah. The T-shirt commodifies the arrangement, which is important, and operates pedagogically in service of a specific politics. The man's arms, for instance, encircle the candidate for Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who gives him the thumbs up sign. The man wears his heart on his sleeve. His cap announces that he's a supporter of President Trump, and a button on his T-shirt confirms his loyalty to Kemp. I should say former President Trump. The caption of the photo identifies the man as anti-Muslim and a guns rights activist, and the article it accompanies makes clear the man's Christian, evangelical, and white supremacist politics, a politics shared by the gubernatorial candidate he endorses. Militant white Christian nationalists, for instance, were among the groups attacking the US Capitol on January 6th, seeking to reclaim the nation for Christ. If the wearers of the t-shirt "Fuck Islam," pictured earlier, ended up having a change of heart after speaking with local Muslims, we can say with certainty that a vigorous anti-Muslim animus continues apace in white politics. While the t-shirts bearing the phrase "Allah is not God" and "Fuck Islam" express very strong sentiments at the heart of a specific version of white politics, they are among a plethora of t-shirts that announce the same world divided into two religions, with Christianity ranked as the only authentic religion and people of European origin installed as an enlightened Christian people who must do battle with Muslims. The popular t-shirt with the word "infidel" in English and in Arabic is visible on the bodies of white men at far right demonstrations throughout the West, in North America and in Europe, and flags a similar structure of feeling that is evident in the phrase "Allah is not God." It expresses that the wearer is a person who relishes the title of infidel, given that it positions him, and it is nearly always men who wear these t-shirts, on the Christian side of European history, and in an apocryphal time of Islamic armies invading Europe. Such t-shirts instruct us in a far-right politics that's openly white supremacist, but we should take care, and we should see, as Junaid Rana and Suhail Dalotsi advise us, that this brand of white politics is not exceptional, but is in fact extensions, in their words, of a racist architecture of control to define the white world. So t-shirts that carry the same civilizational message of an enlightened Christian Europe and a barbaric pre-modern Islam can be conveyed very simply as a feminist message about Islam as uniquely misogynist. This is also part of the anti-Muslim t-shirt stock in trade. The t-shirt that has the slogan, for example, "I am not Islam, Islam is anti-me," echoes the words of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Dutch, Somali, and American anti-Muslim ideologue and former politician who rejects Islam on the basis that it oppresses women. Casting Muslims as uber patriarchs and Europeans as uniquely given to gender equality, democracy, and secularism, Hirsi Ali's position finds wide favor among the right and the left, allowing all to luxuriate in the story of Europe's emergence into modernity and Islam's failure to enter it. It is notable, of course, that Hirsi Ali is herself a former Muslim, and her books reveal her aspirations to celebrate European civilization and to denigrate Muslims as unable and unwilling to integrate into Europe. A new book just came out. T-shirts are a pedagogy they offer a pedagogy of remembrance that structure what memories should inform our social imaginations. And those are Roger Simon's words, a former colleague of mine. T-shirts are intended, he wrote, to provoke and solidify particular affect and meaning. They are investments in an identity that is set apart or against Muslims. They offer us clues about the affective world of the anti-Muslim subject, a world in which whiteness counts and must be protected. As emotions travel between individuals and they feed into a politics that urges bans on covering Islam in the school curriculum, a denial of protection for Muslim children subjected to bullying, bans on the wearing of hijabs and niqabs in public settings, surveillance, indefinite detention, torture, In all of these things, we see the formation of a powerful anti-Muslim affect and the racial violence it underwrites in law and society across the West. The civilizational story in which Muslims take center stage as Europe's antonym features the allegorical figures I wrote about in Casting Out: the dangerous and terrorist Muslim man, the imperiled but increasingly in-your-face Muslim woman, and the civilized European. Since the publication of Casting Out, in the wake of an intensified proliferation of discourses about Muslims as global terrorists, my ideas about the meaning and intensity of the violence directed at Muslims have now expanded to include greater attention to global white supremacy and to the legal regimes that consolidate it through the figure of the Muslim as terrorist. There can be little doubt that today the figure of the Muslim as terrorist lies at the center of a number of repressive policies and practices directed at entire populations. As Dalazzi and Rana say, to be a Muslim, either as a faith figure or a racial figure, is to live a dangerous existence. Muslims join others in communities without the right to have rights. Their situation in camps of various kinds for terror suspects, for asylum seekers, or simply for Muslims are significantly different from the situation of being merely discriminated against. Although the racial aspect of terror at Muslims has always been clear, Muslims are evicted, after all, from political community and humanity and understood as deserving of considerable violence. Anti-Muslim racism comes more fully into view as a racism when we consider the political and economic project to which it contributes, white supremacy. Through violence directed at Muslims, white nations are able to secure white property interests, and white subjects are able to know themselves as superior and deserving through racial violence directed at Muslims. Muslims are not the only racialized group important to white supremacy, but they feature in specific ways when the Christian core of whiteness is touched, as they are when white societies make the case for a superior civilizational status, and when Muslim bodies and lands are targets for violence and appropriation. Islam is made distinct as a racial object of white supremacy, Dalazzi and Rana propose, when we take colonialism, imperialism, and empire into account. In this kind of a framework, anti-Muslim racism must be understood as a transnational phenomenon and one that contributes to the making of a global white supremacy. The Muslim today activates fears of an ungovernable other, but crucially, it is a fear, as Ghassan Haj notes, that is accompanied by another, the fear that Europe is losing its grip over those it has historically dominated. And Europe here stands in for white nations. More than a phobia and a distinct form of racism, anti-Muslim racism should be understood as a crisis of colonial governmentality. So let me get to law. This book is about how racial feelings and emotions, such as those expressed on the t-shirt, form a deeply sedimented anti-Muslim affect that travels through law, forging a global whiteness as it moves. The most striking aspect of how Muslims are taken up in law is the intense negative emotions that anti-Muslim legal and political actors regularly display, an indicator that a strenuous self-making is in progress. These emotions range from desire and disgust to rage and aggrievement that white Christians are culturally and materially imperiled and denied their due. The emotions are all the more striking because of the assumed rationality of the scenes where they are displayed. Western legal traditions are supposed to represent the apotheosis of Western culture, shaped above all by the idea that law is autonomous and objective and is not a party to the violence. Law students are taught that lawyering entails rising above emotional reactions and engaging in dispassionate scientific analysis. Even critical scholars who know that lawyering requires a willful disregard for social context still sometimes maintain that law cannot be transparently reducible to issues of power and believe that objective law exists. This book advances the idea that we know that we are in the presence of race making from those places in law where nothing has to make sense, places where racial and imperial fantasies take root, inviting us to feel rather than to think about the place of Muslims in our world. Feelings and emotions often crowd out rationality, establishing subjects who believe in their own superiority and who are prepared to make it true on the ground. The t-shirt wearer proclaiming that Allah is not God, for instance, strikes up an alliance with a politician, and such alliances are a part of legal efforts to expel Muslims from citizenship and to declare white Christians as the only legitimate citizens. The insistence that Allah is not God, an antonym to Jesus is God, succinctly expresses both the religious and, as I argue throughout this book, the racial boundaries of the nation. At the same time, the statement Allah is not God operates in the same emotional and cognitive register as the earth is flat and viruses don't kill. As most will grant, Allah is simply another name for God. It's tempting to dismiss the t-shirt's claim by noting its incoherence, but it is more important to consider the dimensions of the world that the t-shirt wearer is anxious to promote. Without a logic, but capable of calling Christians into community, the statement Allah is not God is effective in building a politics. The t-shirt shares its effective reach with law, where the Muslim dwells in a place where nothing has to make sense. You have a sentencing hearing at Guantanamo with secret evidence, laws banning Muslim head coverings, a Muslim travel ban, a ban on Arabic calligraphy in art classes. None of it has to be defended on the terms of rationality or conventional law. Prisoners become enemy combatants and are not covered under the Geneva Convention. The accused is not even the accused, but suspected, and has no right of habeas corpus. Instead, the most extravagant emotions hold sway in legal, political, and social settings, where it can be declared Muslims have a catastrophically damaged gene pool. Seeing someone's face is a fundamental value in a secular society. We are dealing with a culturally different enemy who requires torture. Allah is not God. The validity of any of these statements cannot be arrived at unless one accepts the premise of Muslim inferiority and European superiority, a premise that is sustained by racial feeling and emotions. When we are confronted with an incoherence that is obvious, isn't Allah just another name for God? Is there really a gene for violence? Does anyone require torture? It is necessary to ask what the incoherence does rather than search for a logic that is not there. The incoherence observable in anti-Muslim politics makes white community and protects it in law. The emotion unleashed by the statement Allah is not God reveals a possessive attachment to God, and it ushers us to a place of Christian and European belonging. The t-shirt delivers a message with wide appeal. The eviction of Muslims from political community is necessary for the well-being of those for whom Jesus is God. Let me pause for a bit and remind you of what emotions do. As Sarah Ahmed wrote a long time ago, the key question in considering emotions as social and cultural practice is to ask what they do. They circulate and produce identities. The wearers of the t-shirts learn to think of themselves as a different and superior order of humanity. Collectively, they form political community. As Shona Hunter explains, emotions form an affect when anxieties become collectively owned and enacted to form institutional topography, binding people within a social order. Hunter emphasizes that whiteness ascends these are her words, as the cultural manifestation of governmental power through a delusional fantasy structure enacted through paranoid forms of belongings via feelings of persecution, jealousy, and exaggerated self-importance. She draws on Ghassan Haj's paranoid nationalism. Whiteness is an emotional place to dwell, a place peopled by threatening Muslim phantoms, as well as a bunch of other ghostly figures, notably the ghosts of slavery and indigenous dispossession. Spectral Muslims, like the Indian ghosts in René Bergland's canonical text, The National Uncanny, are manifestations of an internalized psychic struggle over the settlers' legitimacy. To believe in one's own racial superiority and entitlement and to enact it, it is necessary to banish from one's consciousness anyone whose existence undermines such claims. Muslims are evicted from consciousness whenever they can be transformed into monsters. Satan incarnate, pedophiles, aggressive wearers of the veil, terrorists, children who carry a propensity for violence in their blood. All of these monsters ensure that European superiority is intact, even as the superior subject is forever haunted by the racial threats that constitute it. If the colonial mindset is an obsessional one, causing colonizers to return again and again to those who haunt them, and if, as Bergland nicely put it, the land is haunted because it is stolen, Muslims join indigenous and Black people, as well as poor people and foreigners, and all of them cast, in Bergland's words, as uncivil, irrational, and even spectral. Race-making through religion proceeds differently in white settler societies, such as the US and Canada, than they do in Europe. And as I mentioned in the conclusion to the book, different still in places such as India and China. But in all of these diverse contexts, one nevertheless finds a classic pantheon of phantom Muslims. As Sophia Arjana has shown, Muslim monsters represent old anxieties about the constitution of Europeans as superior, centuries-old projections that can be found, in her words, on the pages of manuscripts and canvases of paintings, in works of great drama, in poetry and fiction, within travel diaries and government documents, and on screens of movie theaters. Muslims especially haunt the white imagination in those places where real live Muslims stand in the way of capitalist accumulation, and where, by their presence in the Holy Land, they interrupt dreams of the rapture and the end of times, when living and dead believers will ascend to heaven to meet Jesus at the second coming. As Edward Said saw, the Palestinian question becomes the Muslim question in Christian eschatological scenarios. Muslims are in the line of fire whenever their lands attract imperial and colonial ventures, and when they challenge white hegemony as indigenous people, as citizens, as immigrants, as refugees. Of course, Muslims who do none of these things sometimes manage to stay out of the line of fire and may even participate in white anti-Muslim projects themselves, as is the case with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Anti-Muslim racism, like all racisms, develops not from any kind of primordial antipathy between Europeans and Muslims, the so-called clash of civilizations, but instead from racial projects of territorial expansion and capitalist accumulation. I propose that these various racial projects are linked and that it is possible to identify an anti-Muslim racism that knits together white and non-white nations into a global white supremacy anchored in imperialism, colonialism, and racial capitalism. In this book, I offer the argument that law's emotional discourses, places where one finds Muslim phantoms and other racialized threats in abundance, reveal how law undertakes the affective work that shapes the state as a place where whiteness is protected through the figure of the Muslim. The Muslim is a phantom, an imaginary figure of the political unconscious, who installs the European as modern and who haunts the white imagination as Europe's atavistic other. If the European self emerges psychically through the Muslim other, however, the act is one, as Joseph Massad put it, of self-constitution, projection, and imperial strategy. The Muslim is citizen, migrant, refugee, and wartime enemy, real live targets of a long list of extreme and ordinary state violence. Anti-Muslim racism has been called an imaginary racism, and this you see everywhere. And sometimes the illegibility of anti-Muslim racism, even among critical race scholars, is due perhaps, as Junaid Rana and Diane Fugino suggest, to the fact that such critical scholars are more prepared to grant that perhaps an anti-Arab racism exists, notwithstanding the denial of this racism as well. Usually people say Arabs have been racially classified as white in American law. There is no racism. But as Rana and Fugino point out, connecting racism to a specific group, such as Arabs, naturalizes race as real, and it makes racism a phenomenon of a natural antipathy to a group. When Muslims are regarded as a religious group to whom one might feel this antipathy, they are not seen as the targets of racism. So the tendency to regard racism as due to prejudice and to regard religion as separate from race has led scholars to prefer the term anti-Muslim racism, which is a preference I share, rather than its more popular cousin, Islamophobia, in the hope that the structural aspects of anti-Muslim racism and its contributions to the making of whiteness and white supremacy become more salient. Islamophobia is often a term that leaves white supremacy outside the frame of analysis. So, in spite of the long-standing connection between whiteness, colonialism, and Christianity, it is often presumed that anti-Muslim sentiments emanating from white Christians have a straightforwardly religious rather than a racial basis. And these presumptions, I argue, fundamentally miss how a population comes to understand white entitlement through religion. And very crucially, it obscures the basket of fears, aggrievements, and desires, the stuff of which hegemonies are made, that collect in and operate to power white supremacy. Colonial and racial impulses die hard or not at all in a system that is predicated on them. As the African-American writer James Baldwin feared, whites have been in this emotional state of entitlement too long to abandon it. So I'm sort of looking at my time and realizing it's taking a lot longer than I thought, and I really want to get to law before I finish here. So I will just say that the link between whiteness and Christianity and the implications this has for Muslims remains unacknowledged in many quarters. And the elision produces denial that Muslims are constituted as a race, and consequently, denial that anti-Muslim feelings and emotions and the practices they underwrite amount to race making. And very significantly, Muslims become illegible as subjects of racial harm. To cut through all of that, one has to begin with the nature of whiteness and with the project that is white supremacy. When we think of whiteness, then, we could perhaps return to Cheryl Harris's brilliant article, Whiteness as Property, and remember that being white ensures economic returns, a positional superiority that gives whiteness something in common with property, the right to exclude. To the extent one can accumulate it, whiteness offers privilege. Whiteness is also a state of mind. It requires strong emotions about the entitlement of whites and the unfitness of others. It is the site of complicated feelings. As Saidiya Hartman discusses, the denial of Black sentience, the slave's status as object of property, and the slave's suffering blocks white responsibility for Black suffering. The result is that empathy is compromised. Pinar asks, what is the psychosexual structure and historical character of whiteness that renders it so aggressive, so tortured, so interested in subjugation? I think this is a very important question. I don't have time to actually pursue the origins of race in the Christian imagination and its theological roots, which Willie James Jennings has so beautifully done in his book. I also don't have time to fully flesh out the affect of whiteness, but I think one could start with Du Bois's little-known article, The Souls of White Folk, in which he pointed out that whiteness, white orgy, cruelty, barbarism, and murder, these things are driven by everyday rages that take white people to the bottom of the world. Du Bois talked about the snarls of rage that are directed at little Black girls, for example. And of course, Bell Hooks has written very powerfully of the kinds of emotions that are projected in the name of whiteness. Whiteness, we might emphasize, and this will be borne true in the politics, is a kind of frontier aesthetic with its emphasis on aggressive gun-toting masculinity combining with religious fervor. Now, for whiteness and Muslims, theologically articulated and inescapably colonial and imperial, whiteness depends on, even as it produces, a powerful racial affect in which Muslims have a very specific role to play. David Goldberg, in pointing out that race is always knotted with religious resonance, emphasizes that the European is born as a racial category against the figure of the Muslim and the Black, arrangements that predate the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. We are all Moors now, Anud Majid declares. And in fact, there are uncanny similarities between the anti-Muslim bans of today and the 15th century royal edicts of Iberian Spain, prohibiting Islamic dress, Friday prayers, and the speaking of Arabic. These bans are also very similar to the bans directed against the Uyghur population in China. Extraordinary surveillance there and torture and detention. We cannot risk forgetting, however, that as long-term as these feelings and emotions are, we need to remember the ongoing imperatives that drive them. A very key argument in this book is one taken up by many critical race scholars, and notably David Goldberg, on the way in which the religious itself is secularized so that it becomes possible to think about, to express an anti-Muslim racism and a civilizational superiority for Europeans that does not seem Christian at the outset. So my gosh, Sahar, I'm running very out of time, and I really have to get last 5 minutes perhaps to the law. Let me also note that the global war on terror has now sort of enabled states everywhere to label Muslim constituencies with whom they are in conflict as terrorists. And this has absolutely great importance for the kinds of things that we see. Would have liked to get to that too. But let me get to the law quickly to wrap this up. Okay. In his book, Enemy Aliens, law professor David Cole surveys torture at Abu Ghraib, the Supreme Court's enemy combatant decisions, etc., and reflects on the fact that the brutality that we have visited upon suspects in the war on terror is possible in large part because we have portrayed the enemy as less than human. Others have reached the same conclusions. Raciality, Denise da Silva argues, the condition of being raced as an inferior being, lies at the basis of the state's decision to kill certain persons. I quote her here, such killings do not unleash an ethical crisis because these persons' bodies and the territories they inhabit always already signify violence. How do bodies and territories come to acquire the status of those not comprehended by universality, not included in the ranks of the human? Bodies, Silva says, are nobodies, who in the case of Muslims are believed to carry the seeds of violence in their blood. On what philosophical arguments do hierarchies of the human depend? Silva offers an argument in 3 quick steps. First, social scientific accounts of human difference produce persons who are not comprehended by universality. Second, states deploy this arsenal to declare who stands in a negative relation to law and whose annihilation secures the security of the state. And third, whoever endangers the state cannot be construed as legitimate. These 3 steps are important. To stand in a negative relationship to law is to occupy the space reserved for what Silva calls outer determined others, and to be the target of law's violence, as Muslims have been. I emphasize that in this place where you stand in a negative relationship to law, its key feature is incoherence. Incoherence signals the presence of a haunted rationalism, a place where ghosts within the mind are more powerful and more significant than many of the beings who walk abroad. Toni Morrison pointed this out with respect to Blackness. She said, when we see incoherence, contradiction, and emotional disorder, we know that the legal subject is Black. And I would emphasize, we know that the legal subject is Muslim when we see exactly the same things. Courts are able, for example, to believe in the racial science of the expert witness who declares that Muslims have a catastrophically damaged gene pool because the subject being discussed is already deeply known. And so, we can trace the through line from slave law and colonial law to the present day, where Muslim terror suspects, for example, can be waterboarded, or held indefinitely, etc. Nothing has to make sense in a framework that already sets aside a space for the slave and the Muslim. And if we return to sort of the question, what kind of affect does the Muslim body deliver in the law? We see that Muslims are never far from the surface of white fears. And I think it's very important that we remember that claims to modernity and the necessity of law-preserving violence in keeping the unreasonable at bay reach us through the senses as an affect, no less in law than in politics. I think I'm really out of time, Sahar, am I not? And so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sherene Razack. It was truly an honor to host you. I want you to come back so we can see you in person. So we will see you again, inshallah, at Rutgers Law School. And I want to thank our attendees for attending. And we have 2 more lectures coming up in our Transnational Rights and Security series. Dr. Asla Bali from UCLA Law School will be speaking on March 10th about race, empire, and terrorism, with a focus particularly on Libya and the North African context. And then we will have Dr. Wendell Hassan Marsh, who is a Rutgers Newark assistant professor in history, who will be talking about Islam in Africa. And that will be on April 2nd. So hopefully we'll see you all during those events. And in the meantime, please follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR, on Twitter at RUCSRR, and on Facebook at RUCSRR. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Razack. It was an honor and a pleasure. And thank you again. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.